From Roman sandals to Roman tunics, Romans had a flair for fashion that was all their own, but sometimes their outfits were more shocking, revealing, or impractical than stylish. Today we'll take a peek at what Romans wore on their lower half. Women's fashion in ancient Rome was pretty restrictive when it came to the lower half. They were expected to cover up and not reveal too much skin. For this reason, women typically wore long flowing dresses that reached all the way to the ground. These dresses were usually made from linen or wool and were often decorated with embroidery or other embellishments. They could be worn with a belt to cinch in the waist, or with a shawl or cape for added warmth or style. While women's fashion was relatively modest, men's fashion was a bit more daring. Roman men typically wore a tunic that reached mid-thigh length. The tunic was a simple garment that could be made from a variety of materials depending on the occasion. For everyday wear, men might wear a tunic made from linen or wool, while for special occasions, they might wear one made from silk or linen. Tunic also often featured decorative elements such as stripes, patterns, or even images of mythological figures. One of the most iconic pieces of Roman men's clothing was the toga. This was a large piece of fabric that was draped over the shoulders and pinned at the waist. Togas were typically made from wool and were often white, although they could be dyed in a variety of colors for special occasions. Togas were a symbol of Roman masculinity and power, and were often worn by politicians and other important figures. However, they were also quite cumbersome and impractical, which is why they fell out of style after the fall of the Roman Empire. Another item of clothing that Roman men wore was the palla. This was a type of cloak that was worn over the shoulder and was especially popular during the cooler months. Palla were typically made from wool or other warm material, and could be cinched at the waist with a clasp or brooch. They were often worn with a hood and could be used as a blanket or a bed covering when necessary. While palla were practical and versatile, they were not without their critics. Some Romans complained that they were too heavy or bulky, while others felt that they were too revealing since they left one shoulder bare. Despite these complaints, the palla remained a popular accessory for centuries. Another garment worn by both men and women in ancient Rome was the himation. This was a large rectangular piece of fabric that could be worn in a variety of ways. It could be wrapped around the body and secured at the shoulder, or it could be used as a cloak by draping it over the shoulders and cinching it at the waist. Himation were typically made from wool and were often quite colorful. They were a versatile item of clothing that could be worn on special occasions or for everyday use. Men often wore them over their tunics, while women wore them over their long dresses. In addition to these garments, Romans also wore a variety of footwear. For women, sandals were the most common type of shoe, and these were typically made from leather and were fastened with a strap or buckle. They could be worn with or without socks and were often quite colorful. Men's footwear was more varied. They wore sandals similar to those worn by women, but they also wore a type of boot that reached up to the knee or higher. These boots were often made from leather and were used for riding or for special occasions. Now let's explore some shocking, revealing, and impractical fashion choices made by Romans. One of the most revealing items of clothing worn by Roman women was the stula. This was a long, loose-fitting gown that was typically made from linen or wool and reached down to the ankles. Unlike the typical Roman woman's dress, the stola was not designed to be particularly modest and often left the arms and legs bare. This garment was typically worn by prostitutes and other women who worked in the sex industry. It was also sometimes worn by wealthy women who could afford to be more daring with their fashion choices. The stola was often made from expensive fabrics such as silk and was decorated with intricate embroidery and other embellishments. Despite its scandalous reputation, the stola was an important part of Roman women's fashion for several centuries. Another scandalous item of clothing worn by Roman women was the sublegaculum. This was a type of loincloth that was used as underwear and was often made from a simple piece of linen or cotton that was wrapped around the body and secured at the waist. The sublegaculum was typically only visible when the woman was reclining on a couch or in bed, but it was sometimes also worn in public baths or when engaging in athletic activities. While the sublegaculum was practical and comfortable, it was also quite revealing and was seen as a symbol of female sexuality. For this reason, it was often made from sheer or translucent fabrics that allowed the wearer's body to show through. In fact, the sublegaculum was so scandalous that it was sometimes confiscated by the police as evidence of a woman's insane involvement in prostitution. Roman men also had their own scandalous fashion choices. One of the most revealing items of clothing worn by Roman men was the eximus. This was a type of tunic that was shorter than the traditional Roman tunic and was often made from a lighter weight fabric such as linen. The eximus was typically only fastened at the shoulders, leaving the chest and stomach area bare. This garment was often worn by young boys and was considered a symbol of Roman masculinity. The eximus was also sometimes worn by adult men, especially when they were engaging in athletic activities or working in hot environments. It was also a popular choice for street vendors and other working-class men. While the eximus was a practical and comfortable garment, it was also quite revealing and was sometimes seen as a symbol of sexual prowess. Another scandalous item of clothing worn by Roman men was the bulla. This was a type of pouch that was worn around the neck and was used to carry small items such as coins, keys, or jewelry. The bulla was typically made from leather or metal and was suspended from a cord or chain. While the bulla was practical and convenient, it was also quite revealing in its own way. Roman men often wore their bullas over their tunics, which meant that the contents of the pouch were often visible to all. This was especially true if the man was wearing a sheer or translucent tunic. As a result, the bulla became a symbol of the wearer's wealth and status, as well as a way to display their valuables for all to see. Some of the fashions of ancient Rome were not only shocking and revealing, but also completely impractical. Take for instance, the case of the scandalous. This was a type of scraper that was used to remove dirt and oil from the skin. It was typically made from bronze and had a sharp blade on one end and a handle on the other. The stridulus was used all over the body, including the face, arms, and legs. While the stridulus was undoubtedly useful, it was also quite dangerous. The sharp blade could easily cut or scrape the skin, causing pain and even bleeding. It's hard to imagine anyone wanting to use this tool on their delicate facial skin, but apparently it was done. This was especially true among athletes and other physically active individuals who needed to keep their bodies clean and free of dirt and grime. Then there was the modius. This was a type of headdress that was worn by farmers and other rural workers. It consisted of a simple leather band that was tied around the head and had a flap that covered the forehead. The modius was designed to protect the wearer's head from the sun and other elements. However, it was not very effective at doing so. The flap could easily be pushed up or pulled down, and the leather band did little to block the sun or wind. In fact, the modius was so impractical that it was often mocked by Roman poets and playwrights. But despite its flaws, the modius remained popular for centuries. Finally, let's talk about the pedicettes. This was a type of wide-brimmed hat that was worn by travelers and others who needed to protect themselves from the sun. It was typically made from felt or leather and had a very wide brim that extended several inches beyond the edge of the hat. The pedosis was designed to protect the wearer's face and neck from direct sunlight. However, it was also very impractical. The wide brim made it difficult to see, and the hat itself was bulky and heavy. Despite its flaws, the pedicis remained popular for centuries. It was often depicted in works of art, and was even worn by Roman emperors. Ancient Romans had a unique sense of style that was all their own. While some of their fashion choices were practical and stylish, others were more shocking, revealing, or impractical. From the scandalous stola and subligaculum to the dangerous stridulus and the useless modius. Ancient Romans certainly had their share of daring and outlandish fashion choices. But perhaps that's what made them so fascinating. Their willingness to experiment with their appearance and break societal norms continues to captivate us today. If you enjoyed this journey through ancient Roman fashion, stay tuned for more videos like this one. We'll bring history to life with more entertaining and educational content. So sit back, relax, and get ready to learn.